It's over to me, as it's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker of the day, the new Chief Executive for the Robertson Trust, Dr. Jim McCormick. Jim has a wealth of knowledge on the impact of poverty through his work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Edinburgh Poverty Commission, and many other roles on advisory boards. In 2018, he was a travelling Churchill Fellow looking at the impact of mentoring for children and young people facing disadvantage in the USA, Canada, and New Zealand. From his experience, he wrote the paper, A Good Match, What Works in Child and Youth Mentoring. I've got great pleasure to now pass over to Jim.
Thanks very much indeed, and great pleasure to be here. Maureen, thank you really very much, Sarah, Amanda, Katia, all of you for the invitation and all the preparation for this event. I've zoomed in a little later than planned, but I can already tell what a fantastic event this is. I can see the energy around the group. So great to be joining you today. Most of the things in the quiz I didn't do this year, but as you just said, Ali, I did start a new job, and starting a new job in these circumstances is strange, but I have to say I've got a fantastic bunch of new colleagues at the Robertson Trust, two of whom, Christina Keane and Donna Marie Steele, are participating in this event, and that speaks to the Trust's kind of long-standing interest and support for mentoring practices across Scotland. Almost certainly not deep and wide enough, but we definitely are committed in our new strategy to understanding how we can address the root causes of poverty and trauma, including through relational approaches which speak to young people's lives, and mentoring is squarely part of our thinking in that sense. But that isn't really what I'm here to talk about today, but very happy just to say that please consider the Robertson Trust as our doors firmly open to talk to this network and the organisations who form part of it about where we go next with that challenge. So I wanted to say a bit about the findings from my travels back in the day when we were able to do things like that. And Susie White, who I can see here from Inspiring Scotland, some others who were on the event in tandem during its portfolio week last month. With apologies, you've probably heard quite a lot of this already, but I'll try and say one or two things that maybe I haven't shared before. So I'll attempt to share my screen, and let's see if the slides are going to play ball for us today. Or give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides okay. Great, okay. So before I get going, I wanted to say a word about why I was so interested in understanding more about mentoring programs for children and young people, why I wanted to tap into the evidence that's out there in the world, and you know, what we might learn for Scotland's provision, but also what Scotland might share with others. I've always seen this as a kind of two-way learning exchange. And most people who apply to the for Churchill Fellowship do it through their day job. It's to do with their professional area of interest, and it's people from all backgrounds and all walks of life who have taken part in this programme: paramedics, CPNs, youth workers, teachers, nurses, all sorts of people, community development workers. It is definitely not a research scheme. It's not fundamentally about research in the academic sense. It is about a really broad understanding of evidence and insight gathering. But I didn't do this because of my job fundamentally. I did this because of my interest as a volunteer mentor. So for coming up for 4 years now, I've been involved with the MCR Pathways programme in Glasgow, and just completed second match, both cases with young guys at secondary school, broadly speaking, from third or fourth year up to the point they left school. And in the most recent case, you know, we're basically pals for life. He said he looks forward to inviting me to his wedding, where I can sample the cuisine that his family have brought with them when they came from Congo 7 years ago as refugees. Which just got me thinking about transitions and cliff edges and programs, and how early they start and when do they stop, and all those kind of questions. And this opportunity with the Churchill Memorial Trust seemed like a good way to spend a wee bit of time listening and learning, practice in other countries. And I chose the places to visit because of either their long-standing commitment to evaluation, or something they're doing around diversity and equality, or the way in which they've adapted their programs. This is all pre-pandemic, obviously, adapt their programs to particular population groups. And the photo you can see here is the CN Tower in Toronto, lit up during Big Brothers Big Sisters Mentoring Week in September. It seems to be a thing, certainly in Canada and the USA, that a kind of mentoring week is given public visibility by lighting up public buildings in purple. So there you go. I didn't know that till I went on my travels. So was lucky enough to go and take a look at provision around the world, and I chose these three countries and the places within them for reasons I've just shared. And there was a really pragmatic decision to also go where there were opportunities. For example, there's an annual Summer Institute on Youth Mentoring in the USA that brings together, you know, world-class expertise, both practitioner and evaluation and research knowledge. So that was part of why I went to Portland. Also something about being able to access English language evidence. I know that there's a really live European mentoring network that Scottish Mentoring Network is well plugged into. So this was to kind of complement what we know already from European practice, which in many ways culturally is probably a better fit than some of the things I saw. But what I've tried to do here is identify some really common challenges which looked relevant to Scotland, where there might be some things that we could learn and some things that we can share with others. So I was interested in how programs are designed and funded and evaluated. I wanted to focus mainly on school age support, so roughly 5 to 18, and look at different models of mentoring support. I took a closer look at the experiences of young people who have been or are still in the care system, and Indigenous young people. And when you look at a place like Alberta in Canada, there's a very, very strong fit between those two things. Huge overrepresentation in the care system of Indigenous Canadians. And I also wanted to look at this kind of emerging focus on transitional support for over 18s. That wasn't the main focus, but I did want to kind of start exploring what we know already about continuing bridging support when young people leave school, for example. So I've got, I think, 9 points to share, which are kind of distilling a really complex picture, as you would expect, down into a small number of findings and recommendations. And the first is every program I visited in those 10 cities had the same desire to serve many more children and young people, to make sure that the benefits of mentoring support were available. A lot of concern about long queues to be matched, long waiting times, duration matches which weren't as long as programs would have wanted. Really common challenges. And just to speak to a couple of the points that I think were very common as well, a real desire to try and recruit a much more diverse pool of mentors. Picking up on the distinction between the profile of young people, largely we're talking about disadvantaged young people in some ways, and the profile of mentors who were predominantly white, predominantly women, predominantly, you know, in their 40s and 50s. And so that kind of difference in life experience, which that can be turned into an advantage if we get it right in terms of power dynamics, but it can also create a gulf. So a real desire on the part of some programs to think through what would it take to recruit and sustain and support many more minority ethnic mentors, many more men, many more people with relevant life experience, and to do this in a way that is faithful to the standards of programs, and also in a proportionate way build in good enough data and monitoring and evaluation evidence so that programs are really clear on what they do well and where they need to improve. Secondly, on goals, there's a really long-standing debate, I think, in the mentoring world about purpose. And even if you take a really quick glance at, you know, the chronicle and evidence-based mentoring that Gene Rhodes runs out of Boston, you see it all the time. You know, are we here as, you know, mentoring programs and as mentors indeed to, you know, fundamentally, is this about, you know, another consistent adult relationship in the life of a child or a young person? Is this really about turning up, having someone's back, building friendship, building trust and confidence, and then seeing where it goes, you know, rather than setting more specific goals? And there's another point of view that we should be more focused around goals and achieving, helping young people to move on to the next stage in their life. And what became very clear looking at the spread of programs is there seems to be a kind of natural development as young people get older and programs become more focused and more goal specific around, for example, completing school and having a good transition into the next stage of your life, you know, enrolling at college and so on. So I think there isn't probably a conflict here, actually. I think programs have to decide for themselves. But once they've done that, it's important that their choice around purpose is clear, so that everyone knows how we're working together, that what we're doing is truly relevant to young people's lives. You know, if we're offering something that doesn't meet the needs of young people, then that's going to damage motivation on all sides. And whatever our goals are, they should be really reflecting the tools that we use. And what I kind of picked up is although that broadly goes with age, you know, as young people development, there are also some interesting examples of really very early support to think about, you know, career goals and work goals, even in primary school age in, for example, California. And that was really reflecting the kind of desire to really start doing work early around aspirations, and to do that by offering children access to good quality opportunities. Now, whether that's the right thing to do or not, or is effective, time will tell, but a kind of interesting look at, what goals, how early, how are they negotiated, how do we know we're doing the right thing. There's another really specific point about life goals for young people leaving foster care that I'm going to say a word about in a few moments. I want just to get a kind of voice of the mentees in early on, and this is only a kind of really short summary, but the picture is of the Graham Dingo Foundation in New Zealand. They're based just outside Auckland, and this is a foundation, independent trust, focused specifically on driving up the quality of mentoring practice and using data and storytelling and high quality evaluation evidence to really understand how effective our practice is. So really interesting that there's that kind of anchor organisation for New Zealand. But these bullet points come from the first group I met in New Zealand, which was a group of about 10 young people who were part of different mentoring programs, and they come together once a year from across the country to I think a 3 or 4 day residential, and they reflect on what they've learned as young people, but they also, more importantly, I think, are involved in co-designing the next phase of the foundation's work. So they help to identify good questions, they help to identify good design elements for programs. And when I asked them over lunch, what in your view makes a good mentor? I won't read this, but here are some of the things that they said. For example, someone who's interested in your interests and your future, doesn't judge you, and someone you can have fun with. I also heard young people saying, when I'm with my mentor, it's a space away from the pressures of schoolwork. It's a space away from some things I can't talk to my family about. And just by spending this time, it helps me be re-energized and get back on track and get the schoolwork finished. So it's really interesting, that kind of combination of non-specific mentoring support that can help, with other things that you're doing in your life, even though they're not directly connected. Here is another quick glimpse of a program which is Big Brothers Big Sisters. So that's kind of international network that was present in all the countries I visited. This is the one in Greater Los Angeles. This is a very, very impressive group of women who have gone out with a really kind of bold set of asks to the corporate sector in particular. Really interesting feature of the North American mentoring landscape, where very wealthy corporations are asked to stump up not just cash, but be really invested in their staff being mentors for the long term. And so what they do in LA is about money. It's about driving up the match duration rate, but also interestingly doing that bridge building around really high quality work and educational experiences. And they are quite demanding about what is, where they've set the threshold in terms of quality for work experiences. And they've got a really interesting women in entertainment focus, where they try and connect, girls and young women from very, very disadvantaged neighborhoods into, world-class filmmaking, script writing, all sorts of opportunities that make kind of virtue of location, which is in many ways a kind of unique thing for that part of the world, but some general principles around the importance of connecting young people into high quality opportunities they might otherwise not have. So just to say a few other points that come out of the findings. So to say a word about near peer mentoring approaches, and broadly speaking, there were two things I think I saw going on. One is when high school teens become the mentors, they are matched with elementary or primary school children to to help with, homework and give a bit of advice on how things are going with their siblings and their families, that kind of pretty informal teen mentoring. And on that front, I saw quite a lot of that in North America. On that front, the evidence base is really quite weak, actually. Probably those programs benefit the teen mentors in terms of their development and their CV preparation and so on. And that's great. And there's also some evidence that if you can attract, kids who aren't the most confident or aren't the ones breezing through to university, if you can attract them into those programs, then the gains are really quite big. But there's much less evidence of how younger children benefit from that kind of near-peer mentoring, at least as yet. It doesn't mean it's not effective, it just means we haven't got good evidence. But I think more promisingly, though, on near-peer mentoring, is examples when mentors who are, maybe late teens, early 20s, probably they are students, some might be graduates, they become mentor/coaches or mentor/tutors. And these are in programs which are more specific about their goals. So the kind of, in some ways, the most interesting example I saw was in Oregon, in Portland, 2 programs called My Life and Better Futures. And these are very rigorous self-determination programs, focused on 15 to 17-year-olds who are in foster care and are preparing to leave foster care. And the odds of having any kind of effective reuniting with family are quite low. And often in those programs, there are significant mental health barriers, and there's also a strand around learning disability. So a really interesting focus on young people who have got it pretty tough in life. And those programs, the role of the mentor coaching follows a really strongly evidence-based curriculum. So it's a world away from most of what we know, I think, around mentoring. But it also is focused on empowerment and voice. I think it might have something quite interesting for us around the promise that we're developing in Scotland. And when it works really well, young people, there are examples of basically co-chairing their own case conferences. So all those professionals around the table, instead of them telling young people what's going to happen, it's much more negotiated. And then the mentor slash coach is invited in to sit alongside the young person, as their advocate when that's appropriate. But there are some really important power aspects built into how those programs run, and they've been evaluated to a very high standard as well. So again, quite an unusual example, but because of the small gap in age and because of the relevant life experience of the mentors, I think we should put that kind of example in the category of very promising. So I better watch my time here and move along more quickly. Just to say on blended approaches, I think I picked up that group mentoring is sometimes seen as a second best, and one-to-one matches are the gold standard. And that's probably true in many cases. But I saw also great examples in different countries, actually, of group mentoring being used in a more kind of proactive way. So where you've got a limited pool of mentors, which is often the case, if you can bring in 3 mentors into a group of 10 young people, and there's a kind of good range of backgrounds amongst those 3 mentors, then you're spreading your resource more broadly, and you're also offering young people a kind of mentoring space that they may prefer, actually, compared to a one-to-one match. And I came across examples of young people in residential care in New York for whom one-to-one mentoring had failed. It just didn't work. Kids who felt let down almost throughout their lives, asking them to strike up a new one-to-one relationship is quite a demanding proposition sometimes. But using a group circle-based approach worked really effectively. and the match rate was much better. And on the back of that, some moved successfully into one-to-one match. Another example from New Zealand would be in cultural communities, particularly Pacifica communities, where there's much more of an emphasis on the collective good than the individual good. Mentoring circles, especially for young women, have been used really effectively, and also those mentees have chosen for themselves who they want to bring in as their group of 2 or 3 mentors. So again, something really interesting about empowerment if we get that right. And so looking at kind of consciously how we can blend group and one-to-one mentoring is a kind of interesting point. And then on the next point 5 about mentoring programs, adapting to serve specific populations, but in this case I looked at children and young people in care. I've already mentioned that work in Portland, which is really interesting. The other example would be from Alberta in Canada, where the kind of infrastructure body for the province, Alberta Mentoring Partnership, has developed some really high quality resources for mentoring for young people in care. So they've worked through, caseloads and what you have to do in terms of high quality screening and training and mentor supervision, how you do a good job of maintaining family involvement where that's feasible. Really kind of thoughtful practices being developed there. I should say a word about the photograph before I move on. Apologies. This is a group of young people in San Francisco at a program called First Exposures, and they use photography. So it's a kind of skill building mentoring program. They use photography as the medium, and they do small group mentoring, so 2 mentors to 5 or 6 young people during the summer, and the other stuff happens during the school year. And this is one example of a really kind of interesting skill building approach to mentoring, where youth voice is well kind of foregrounded. Got a couple more slides to go, so I'll try and pick up the pace, Maureen. This point about cliff edges in times of provision, what became really evident was the transitions that just happen in children and young people's lives all the time. That could be moving between schools. It could be care placement movements, which we know happen far too often. There was an example, a really sobering example in Christchurch in New Zealand, caused by 2 earthquakes and population movements that had to happen immediately, and schooling disrupted and natural supports being disrupted. And also, leaving school to go to college or work. So these transitions are one of the biggest challenges, I think, for us, so that we don't design programs only around, particular points in a young person's life as far as possible. And I saw real restrictions in some programs that are school-based in the USA in particular, where they end when children leave elementary school. And on the other hand, great examples in New Zealand of bridging support when children move from primary to secondary, and then when they leave school. So in the report, there are kind of real examples of do's and don'ts that I think are relevant. But I suppose the important point for me was, if we want to build friendships that over time, where possible, become more like natural supports in the lives of young people, that's kind of stretching ambition, or even just improve match duration rates, then the last thing we should be doing is creating these cliff edges, especially in the lives of marginalised young people who have seen relationships come and go throughout their young lives already. There's also an example in the report of United Way in Toronto, which pulls through its mentoring support for the 18 to 29-year-olds age group. Has a strong focus on employment and skill building, and uses technology in a really interesting way to achieve faster, longer matches, which are probably not appropriate for younger people, but for adults, I think, look really very interesting. On becoming culturally rooted, the challenge that I heard was, and you see this in the work of Jean Rhodes as well, you see it in it's a really good book on critical mentoring that also poses this challenge from the perspective of race and ethnicity. What are we saying in the mentoring world about power and inequality and poverty and structural disadvantage? Now, I think self-evidently mentoring can't solve those problems alone. But what it can do, where possible, is adapt our provision to really serve the diverse needs of young people, to make sure they're involved in designing and improving the support that's out there. I saw great examples of, I mentioned earlier, Indigenous Canadians in places like Edmonton, who just didn't think the existing offer was relevant to them because it wasn't, and something better being put in its place. I saw in Calgary examples of young LGBTI people who also felt what was being offered wasn't relevant to them, so changes were made. I saw examples of young people living in really remote, rural parts of Canada for whom face-to-face mentoring was never really much of an option. And so even before the pandemic, some quite inventive uses of technology being put in place to match people with similar life experiences or similar goals around careers and so forth. So technology was here before the pandemic, and we should be thoughtful about how to continue using it later. And there's also, just to be quite specific, there are examples from New Zealand of school-based mentoring and tutoring programs, which finally we've got some evidence of provision that was having a significant impact on closing the attainment gap for Māori and Pacifica kids from low-income neighbourhoods. So there are ways in which mentoring can do some quite powerful things. And on that point of youth-directed, second last point, so examples of young people becoming quite demanding and really having quite high expectations of how their mentoring experience could link into more of a kind of campaigning and social movement building experience. And so there are a few examples in the report of how mentoring programs have kind of got behind young people, especially around reshaping the foster care system, again, very relevant to the promise here in Scotland, but on other things as well around disability discrimination, around hate crimes and so on. So, enabling young people to become those leaders of the future is a kind of really interesting part of what mentoring could be a catalyst for. I should say these photographs, on the left, Shanna Malio, a woman I met in Auckland, who at that point was running the MATES programme, which is the mentoring and tutoring programme for both primary and secondary school kids. And on the right is Springboard Community Works, Dan and Sherilyn, who are from just north of Auckland. And I'll finish in a moment on why what they do I think is so relevant. And this final point is about embedded mentoring support, rather than standalone programs. And so where we've got community anchor organizations, rooted in communities, with a well-known name, trusted by families, a place to go in normal times. What mentoring can do in that mix, it can open other doors more naturally. And so this photo is of a young woman called Lorna, whom I met in Wellington it's a program run by the Boys and Girls Institute called Challenge for Change. And without going into the details of the program, it sits within a mix at that institute of education and work and apprenticeship opportunities, a route into sport, art and drama, really mature support for families around conflict resolution and psychological support for parents. And in fact, kind of interesting, maybe kind of controversial element was for young people to take part in the mentoring programs, their families also had to sign up to being on board and being a full part of the progress a young person was making. So to cut that long story short, really about how community anchor organisations can open doors to high quality opportunities in addition to the mentoring relationship being the foundation at the heart of it. I've no doubt gone on a little bit too long, apologies, Maureen. I'll just finish by saying I would love to keep the conversation going with the network and with your member organisations. These guys on the left from Alberta Mentoring Partnership are the ones I think who have most put their hands up and said they would love to strike up a relationship with what we're doing in Scotland. So let's maybe talk about that in particular. And you can see just some social media handles if you're interested in finding out more about the work of the Robertson Trust or indeed the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. And I will stop sharing the screen now. Thank you very much for listening.